My name is Collin Mayfield. I am an independent journalist from Auburn, just right down the road. And earlier this year, I made the decision of going to Ukraine. I flew to Kiev February 20th. And at the time, we were uncertain about whether or not there was going to be the invasion. At first, I didn't think much was going to happen. I thought I was just going to go photograph troop preparations and build up and then go home. Little did I know that 3 days later, Russia would launch a full-scale invasion across all of Ukraine and start the largest war in Europe since the Second World War. So this is some of my experience over those 4 months. So a little bit of background. In 2014, Ukraine had a pro-Russian president named Viktor Yanukovych. Now, Yanukovych scuttled an earlier agreement to become closer to the European Union, and this led to widespread protests, the Euromaidan protests in Kiev. And Yanukovych responded by having his police fire on protesters. But ultimately, protests were successful, and Yanukovych's government was ousted from power. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and within a few days after that, in the Donbass, the region of Ukraine closest to Russia on the east, that's historically more Russian-speaking, more culturally aligned with Russia, separatists in the Donbass broke away in the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk and established the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. And it was also at that time that Crimea was annexed. So this is when this conflict began. So one of the first things I did in Kiev was I went to the Russian embassy, and I saw protesters setting up crosses evocative of those who were already killed in the war in Donbass that had been happening for the past 8 years. And it was very tense at the embassy. We could see smoke pouring out of it. So clearly the Russians were burning pertinent documents. Next one. So, and here's another shot of the Russian embassy. About 2 days later, the embassy was evacuated. So the night of February 23rd, I traveled east to Kharkiv. Kharkiv is Ukraine's second largest city, and it's very close to the Russian border. It's within 20 miles of the Russian border. I was originally staying in this hostel right by the train station. A friend joked that it was a critical piece of infrastructure and it was surely going to get bombed, but that ended up not being the case. But the next morning, at about 5 o'clock, Russia began their initial salvo into Kharkiv. They bombed multiple civilian areas. You can get the next one. Hitting the area with BM-21 Grad rockets, or mostly Grad rockets, but also cluster munitions and the occasional cruise missile. This is in the Saltivka neighborhood north of Kharkiv. This was devastated by shelling. So this is a Khrushchevka coming from Nikita Khrushchev. It's one of the Soviet commie block apartments, very common in Eastern Europe. And these Khrushchevka were just pockmarked with these Grad rockets. The Grad is a multi-stage rocket. It's very common in a lot of these post-Soviet countries. So the way it would work, it's multi-stage. So these rocket engines were just all over, sometimes in fields, sometimes in the cities, just sticking into the ground. There's another Khrushchevka inside. And then the next several are just Khrushchevka. That's part of a Grad rocket. More in the Saltivka neighborhood. Saltivka was really devastated. It's on Kharkiv's northeast. So yeah, the Russian armor pushed in towards the city, but the Ukrainians were able to defend it. The initial Russian strategy was hoping to overwhelm cities of Kiev, Mariupol, Kharkiv with a very quick assault, and taking those major population centers would demoralize the Ukrainian people and force the government into capitulation. But as we all know, those major cities managed to hold. So here's you can go and go this one.
Okay.
May have included a few too many of Saltivka damage, another Grad rocket. And then it was on my third day that I was finally able to get to the front lines. I went to the rear of the Ukrainian front, and this was on the very northern edge of Kharkiv, past the Saltivka neighborhood. Past past the Saltivka neighborhood. Civilians would, shelter underground during all that time, but yeah, a lot of their salvo seemed indirected, and they just hit random things that it really seemed. For example, this is a monument to the Second World War they hit. They managed to bomb this. They did not bomb the train station, which I found really interesting given how many Ukrainian soldiers I saw passing through it for the sake of going up to Kharkiv to defend the city. Those are fragments from a grad rocket. And yeah, I found it quite ironic that in this war of denazification, as Putin claimed as his pretext for annexation, I found it interesting that he bombed the World War II monument. But nevertheless, so here's from my first experience at the front. The Ukrainian captain, he permitted photography, but he told us for security reasons we couldn't photograph any faces. Even he thought the city wasn't going to last, and that there was going to have to be an insurgency, so that everyone was very skittish about having their face shown. This is also when I saw the first corpse of my career. It was a single Russian. The captain speculated that he may have been a conscript, but there's really no way of knowing. And they hadn't moved him. He was mutilated. You could see the bones inside of his hand. But the reason they hadn't moved him was behind his head, between his head and the earth, was pinned a dented RPG. And the captain was saying how if they moved him, he might go off. So nobody wanted to touch him. He was lying there for months before they finally pulled him out. I managed to return to that spot in Kharkiv in mid to early May, and they'd finally pulled him out, but there was a puddle of flesh where he'd been. He just was lying there rotting. The soil was discolored and oily. It was a gruesome sight for sure. And ordnance still remained, but at least that time around there was no snow on the ground, so I could see the ordnance, and I didn't have to worry about stepping on any of it. While I was at the front photographing the corpse, the Ukrainians began shelling towards the Russian lines, and the Russians returned a volley in return. Of course, we decided we were going to go shelter, so we dove into the nearest trench, and fortunately, the artillery was a lot further down the lines and it was nowhere near us. So after a brief time sheltering, we left, we went to the train station, and fares were suspended just for the sake of getting all the civilians out. So here we have some civilians fleeing here. Men between the ages of 18 and 60 were barred from leaving the country. They have a draft system, but they don't have the same type of conscription that the Russians have. But at the same time, they don't need to, because people. It's a lot easier to get people to defend their homes than invade somebody else's home. And here's a babushka I met who was fleeing. She was going west to Poland. This is the regional administrative building in Kharkiv. This was only about 6 blocks from my hotel. I was staying in a very nice hotel called the Kharkiv Palace, and it was a media frenzy. There were about 30 to 40 journalists there from all over the world. It was great networking for me. There's a silver lining in that. But it was a beautiful hotel. They told us that Moscow had been alerted of our presence. We thought, they're not going to bomb us. And so that regional administrative building, which was right by my hotel, it ended up being hit by 2 Russian cruise missiles. And after the fact, we were able to go inside of it with territorial defense soldiers and emergency medical responders. The blast killed upwards of 39 people, I think, and wounded scores more. 3 of those killed were children. This is Oleg. He was my guide in the Territorial Defense Force. Really nice guy, despite his far right politics. But yeah, while we were going through, the EMTs actually they found a hand. They weren't sure who it belonged to, but they did show us this hand that they pulled out of the rubble soon before we got there. But it was just very precarious walking through it. You take the stairs up to the 6th floor, and you just be careful not to fall through the floor. In one of these, we went past it. It doesn't matter if we did. It was just there's the crater left behind from one of those Russian cruise missiles. So So these are all pictures from inside, yeah, there's the crater. All pictures from inside the regional administrative building. This is one of those times that Russia actually did manage to hit a military target. I don't know how much of it was just inefficiency from their old Soviet arsenal. You know, they used a lot of unguided ordnance, and they just devastated a bunch of civilian areas. And like that World War II monument, some of the targets were seemingly random and not military, but this was one of the few that did serve a purpose, it seemed. But the Ukrainians got the street cleaned very quickly. Within a few weeks, they removed a lot of the rubble, got all the cars off. One thing that a lot of these soldiers told me was they didn't want their city to look like Syria. And it was just insane how quickly they were able to pull the engine of a Smerch rocket. I misspoke earlier, that was a Smerch rocket, not a Grad rocket. There's a difference between the two. The ones stuck in the ground with the fins were Smerches. But just it was amazing how quickly they managed to pull Smerch rockets out of the ground and re-asphalt as if it was never there. It was really astonishing how quickly they were able to get the city cleaned. But let me keep going. Just more in the surrounding area. A lot of nearby buildings were damaged by the blasts from the cruise missiles. It was scary stuff for sure. And we have a first responder, Oleg, and another soldier in the Territorial Defense Force. And they were removing another body as we left. And taking him to the morgue, which was overflowing at that point. They had to use some nearby buildings. So after that, I went to Dnipro. I went south to Dnipro, and taking that main road, we passed through several barriers. Some of them were manned by police, some of them by territorial defense. And that one we were just on, it's actually funny. It says in Ukrainian, Putin huilo. Putin is a dickhead. And here we have the Putler Buster poster in Dnipro. I'm huilo, I'm a dickhead. Dnipro was nice because it was far enough away from the front that there wasn't any active fighting there. It was still at risk of airstrikes, but in Dnipro, they would mobilize troops. Like this is David Cherkasky. He's a young officer candidate that I met, or cadet rather, a cadet that I met. I think he's been commissioned at this point. But he and his father were both Hasidic Jews who signed up to fight. It was amazing how they were able to keep kosher. His father had his kippah on under his cover, so it was great being able to meet the two of them. But in the Dnipro, soldiers would mobilize, and soldiers would also go on leave. I actually I got to go to a sauna with some members of the infamous Azov Battalion in Dnipro, and just being able to take leave, being able to be at the front for 2 to 3 weeks, and then have a few days to a week off in a safe city like Dnipro, where stores are still open. It really boosted morale, and it kept the Ukrainians proficient, rested fighters compared to the Russians, who were overstretched on the front lines and exhausted. And this is the next several are from an airstrike in Dnipro. And the interesting thing about this is this building is it's an abandoned shoe factory, completely random. It was an abandoned factory that they bombed, and it did damage some of the neighborhood nearby. But again, I'm just astonished at the fact that this clearly useless building was bombed. But nevertheless, Dnipro was also a useful hub for preparing for the war effort. So the way Dnipro is located, Dnipro is north of Zaporizhia, where there's the nuclear power plant that Russia captured. It's south of Kharkiv, and it's west of the Donbass. So you'd have troops from all areas taking leave there, and you'd also have civilians gathering supplies there, whether they be medical supplies, food, ballistic vests, etc. Anything for the war effort. They also would make camouflage netting, which was in short supply, which I think some of the several next ones are camouflage netting. Yes. Straps of cloth, old shirts, old washcloths, and they put them over like hog wire, or not hog wire, plastic trellis. They just put them over plastic trellis for the sake of making net to conceal soldiers. And it was just, this is something that a lot of the teenagers would do. Like everybody who could was helping in the war effort somehow. And another thing that was done to help the war effort early in the war, before they got all the American in-laws and stingers and javelins, was, of course, the Molotov cocktails. And this is another thing that Russia didn't manage to bomb. I went to an undisclosed location on the Dnipro River, and it was a Molotov cocktail factory. And they were making thousands of these. They were a mix of gasoline, styrofoam, and motor oil. Motor oil to stretch it. The styrofoam, when dissolved in gasoline, it gives it a thick, sticky consistency, similar to a napalm, and it makes it burn a lot longer, and it also makes it stick to its target. A well-placed Molotov can disable armor. It's obviously difficult and no javelin, but it can work, and the Ukrainians made it work at the very beginning. And as a side note, one of my first purviews into journalism was the 2020 civil unrest, and I was at a riot in Birmingham. And these kids' Molotovs were just a basic glass bottle with just gasoline in it, and they burned off in a couple of seconds and didn't do anything. So the styrofoam is essential for getting it to work. But yeah, these militia, these territorial defense soldiers, they were school teachers a few weeks before the invasion. They both worked in an elementary school, and now their full-time job was making Molotov cocktails, for the time being at least. And they showed a few of them to us. They burned for quite a while. It was pretty effective. The styrofoam makes a hell of a difference. It was also at the Dnipro that the civilians would sandbag statues. And this was something I heard as a criticism from a lot of Westerners. Why would you waste sandbags on a statue and not a house? But that's preserving these landmarks is quintessential for the Ukrainian war effort, because so much of this war is Russia denying the right of Ukraine to exist. Ukrainians have their own language. It isn't entirely intelligible by, if you're a Russian speaker, but a lot of Russians deny that and say that Ukrainian is just a backwater version of Russian, which is not the case. One of these next ones is actually, that's a statue of Taras Shevchenko that civilian volunteers were sandbagging. Shevchenko was around during the Tsar's era, and Shevchenko was actually arrested for writing in Ukrainian. So preserving these Ukrainian cultural landmarks is just quintessential in preserving their right to exist as a people. So I use the Dnipro as a base, and I frequent back and forth between the Dnipro and Kharkiv, using Dnipro as a place to wash clothes, rest, do what I needed to do, and be able to sleep without artillery waking me up. So I returned to Kharkiv, and the Ukrainians had held the line. My first week in Kharkiv, the Russian military had surrounded much of the city. It was semi-encircled. In the fog of war, we thought that we were completely under siege at the moment, but that turned out not to have been the case. When I returned to Kharkiv my second time, they'd held very well. They pushed the Russians back in a few places. The city only had one side that was under attack. And throughout this time, I was escorted by sometimes Army, sometimes Azov, and a lot of times mostly territorial defense soldiers, since they had the most free time, since they were the least professional soldiers. The Azov were always very busy because they're pretty competent fighters. So this is another building in Kharkiv that was bombed with my territorial defense guide, Alexei. Yeah, Alexei was very useful. He took us to a lot of places we had not previously been, all across the north of the city. One of the places he took us to in one of these next few is Barava Shova Market. We'll get to in just a second. Now, another thing I think that definitely boosted morale was they had the liberty to wear whatever patches they wanted. Sometimes this could be a little controversial. I can't lie, I did see an SS patch or two, but a lot of Nordic patches. Oh, that previous car was allegedly, according to the Ukrainians, this was a civilian whose car was hit by a Russian drone. I don't know that to be the case, but it would not surprise me, since thousands of civilians have been killed. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that's 100% the truth. They took what remained of her body off the street shortly before I got there, just leaving a puddle of blood. Then we went to Special School 134. So when the Russians pushed the farthest they did into Kharkiv, they took over the specialized school. It was a Spetsnaz unit. And eventually, the building caught fire, whether it was from the shooting or deliberately set, we don't know. But Spetsnaz and respirators waited within the school for several hours before several of them died. Some died of asphyxiation from broken respirators, some burned to death, others were shot trying to escape. But this was one of the furthest points in the city that the Ukrainians, or that the Russians managed to push into. But they were unsuccessful at holding the school and subsequently were pushed back. Yeah. Sorry for the duplicate, I guess. Don't know how that got in there. This one, I was told, was shot by a javelin. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a crater left by it. This is a Russian BTR. Russia has got a very armor-heavy military, and a lot of analysts have said this war spells the death of the tank, just given how many burnt armored vehicles, whether they be BTRs or MTLBs or what have you, just easily taken out by javelins and stingers and in-laws. It's just Russia's armor-heavy forces could not withstand these troops that had a few hours of training, a few hours to a few weeks with these Western weapons. And I think these next few are going to finally be Barabashova. Now, Barabashova, yes, Barabashova is Europe's largest open-air marketplace. It's the biggest in Europe. Thousands of or hundreds of shops, thousands of shoppers, and it was bombed. And we went after it was bombed, and while we were there, the bombing started up again. So we were only there for about 20 minutes before having to very hastily flee to our car because we could hear the incoming, and Barabashova was hit very soon after we left. But fortunately, none of us were injured, although I did end up getting sick because my dumbass did not bring a respirator because I didn't think anything was going to happen. Now I'm going to make sure I don't make that mistake again because breathing in all that burning paint did not do me well. I ended up having to go to the doctor in Dnipro about a week later because I started coughing up blood. So, good times. I ended up getting to go back to Barabashova a few weeks later with another soldier in the territorial defense, Sergey. Sergey was great. He's a former cigarette salesman, and because of that, he spoke English perfectly. Unlike Alexei, who didn't speak any English, so it kind of made it could make things difficult at times because I do not speak Ukrainian or Russian, unfortunately. So we returned to Barabashova, and Sergey showed us the remnants of Grad rockets that had ruined it. Store owners were just trying to scavenge what they could, but really there was not much other than scrap. Very, very little survived. This isn't really a clear image, but what you can see in the crater is the remnants of a BM-21 Grad rocket. More of Barabashova. It was just heartbreaking. And here Sergey was on camera being interviewed by us, and he's just giving his disdain for the fact that this is clearly not a military target. A lot of analysts are saying that the reason Russia has been bombing these civilian areas is just to break the morale and break the spirits of the Ukrainian people. But instead, all that's done is galvanize them against them. In the Donbass, there are some that are pro-Russia. I did meet a handful of civilians in Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts that were pro-Russia, but across most of the country, Ukrainians are Ukrainian. There's a Kazakh restaurant that got bombed. Who knows, they might have thought it was an Azov base. And here are two other soldiers in the Territorial Defense Force that were with me. The man in the sweater is Shrek. His granddaughter gave him that call sign. And the man in the camouflage is Wild Hog. They were both really great tour guides. They brought us all around. Wild Hog was actually part of a street gang called the Hunters of Kharkiv, and they would go around beating up drug dealers before the war. So, and then he found himself in defending from Ukraine. And then Shrek's, or defending from Russia. And then Shrek's reasons for joining the territorial defense. He did want to defend his city from Russia. That was very important to him. But his main reason, and I found this to be hilarious, was he wanted to catch looters. That's what he gave us on interviews, why he joined up. But they took us to a lot of other neighborhoods that we had not been in yet. Just like I said, lots of civilian damage. This is Shrek outside of a jail. Actually, the inmates were evacuated, but after the fact, the jail was bombed. I guess maybe it was an attempt to bomb the jail, have inmates escape and wreak havoc, but that was not successful because, like I said, they were removed. And, here's more in that general area. Another shot of the jail and Shrek. He was great. He spoke a little bit of English. But yeah, another neighborhood that was bombed. This one was near a technical university. It was an aerospace school. So we went in the remains of that, and then looking out the window, you just see this this neighborhood that was destroyed. They dropped cluster munitions across lots of the city. And you can see the husks left over from Smerch rockets that were carrying cluster munitions. So lots of civilian neighborhoods got hit that way. These are more images of Khrushchevka damaged in Saltivka. Most of the civilians who lived there, most of them were either living in their basements or they had fled at that point, either out of Kharkiv or to live in the metro in the city center. A lot of people were living in the subway just for the sake of it being the one safe place they could be. We were allowed to go in a number of people's homes. This says children to no avail. It didn't really make a difference whether or not you spray paint children on the side of your building. It's still going to get hit. And this child, his mother didn't want his name disclosed, but she did allow for us to take his portrait in front of his apartment building. And it's just really, really difficult seeing this kid who's just lost everything and had his house blown up. But it's just devastating. That's another part of a grad rocket. And it's just so much damage. It was just quite bad. So, it was soon after this that I ended up leaving Kharkiv, not just for a little stint in Dnipro, but genuinely leaving for an extended period of time. And I went to Transnistria. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, Russia backs separatists. They back separatists all across this area. They also back separatists in Georgia. Georgia has two breakaway states. There's the unrecognized Abkhazia and also South Ossetia. Now, I wanted to go visit some Russian-backed separatists and get another side of the story because I'd only been with Ukrainians. And it would have been very difficult for me to go to Poland and then go to Belarus and then fly to southwestern Russia and then go to the DPR, LPR. And because I couldn't afford to do that, and that would be incredibly difficult for me to do, the separatists I decided to go see were in this place called Transnistria. Now, Transnistria is internationally recognized as Moldova. Oh, those photos are of a fire station that got bombed. This is some of their interesting decor, but yeah, this fire station was hit by a number of rockets. But Transnistria is internationally recognized as part of Moldova, and most Moldovans are, ethnically Romanian. They speak Romanian, they have a Romanian culture, a lot of them want union with Romania, but on the eastern bank of the Dniester River, they're mostly ethnic Russians. And when the Soviet Union was breaking away, they didn't want to be part of Moldova, especially after seeing Moldova adopt basically the same flag as Romania. They thought that they were going to be a suppressed minority. So starting in 1990, they started arming themselves. They established local Soviets and were pushing towards independence. And after that 1991 coup, the Soviet coup by hardliners who wanted to maintain the Soviet Union, after that coup failed, they decided that they were going to break away and be part of their own country. And that country is the Pridnestrovyan Moldavian Republic. And it's obviously not recognized by anyone but other separatists. And of course, Russia has a consulate. Side note, these Russian armored vehicles, they were not destroyed there. What the Ukrainians did with a lot of them was they had them towed and then would use them for barricades. So using their armor against their armor. It was quite smart for them to do that. And yeah, here's finally Transnistria. So that flag on the left, it looks like that of the Soviet Union, except it has a green stripe through it. It's the flag of Transnistria, and of course it's flying alongside the flag of the Russian Federation. Because a Transnistrian passport's worthless, they all have Russian passports. So Transnistria, right here. At the very beginning of the war, Belarus, Russia's client state, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, showed a map that showed Russian forces moving towards Transnistria. And so clearly it was important for them to try and take that. And they were trying to build a land corridor. To Transnistria, but the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Mykolaiv and Kherson has been quite successful, and I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. It's going to be very unlikely for them to make that land corridor. But like I said, Transnistria, it's neo-Soviet. They're more hammers and sickles than any guest can count. They're everywhere. The time capsule. It was a fascinating place to be. It was insane. But I was not there for very long. Here's a Russian recruitment poster. There are Russian troops stationed there. There's a few hundred of them. There's the operational group of Russian forces in Transnistria that has about 1,500 to 2,000 soldiers, but only about 300 to 400 are there at any given moment. The Transnistrians themselves have an active force of about 7,000 soldiers, give or take, and about 15,000 reserves. But what constitutes a reserve is uncertain. And also, like I said, since everybody has a Russian passport, what makes someone a Russian soldier is unclear. So I was there for 3 days. Everyone there is staunchly pro-Russian, and despite the communist aesthetic, it's actually a corporate monopoly. There is a single company that owns everything. It's called Sheriff. Now, the tobacco stores, the liquor stores, the Mercedes-Benz dealership, they even have a football club, FC Sheriff. It beat Real Madrid, actually, back in 2019, I think it was. But Sheriff owns everything. Like, they own all the grocery stores. It's actually a common joke. Every country has a grocery store, but here, the grocery store has a country. So I was taking photographs of Sheriff properties my final day in Transnistria, when a police van pulled up beside me and they asked to see my travel slip. I obliged and gave it to them, and they checked my passport and they told me I could be on my way, and I asked if I could take a picture of one of the policeman's patches, and he said that was fine. And yeah, I took a photo of his patch, and I got on my way and I started walking, and I noticed the van was trailing me and the driver was on the phone. And next thing I knew, at this point I noticed they were following me, so I'm rapidly deleting things off my phone, like the Russian consulate, incriminating text messages, anything that could get me in trouble. Didn't matter, because the van pulled up beside me, the two cops jumped out, they grabbed me, threw me into the van, I slammed my shin against the door, and they drove me to the corner of Karl Marx Street and dropped me off at this government building. They passed me to two soldiers who bent my arms back. One soldier on my left had my right hand, and the other soldier on my right had my left hand. They pulled my shoulders back, marched me up into the building, and the first thing I saw was the seal of the Ministry of State Security, the MGB. And a number of people, both Ukrainian and Moldovan, told me not to go because I was probably going to get detained by the MGB, and I just disregarded it. They tossed me in a cell, a little concrete cell. I did harass my jailer, and he let me smoke cigarettes through the window. Of course, they were sheriff brand. And they took my phone and my camera, and the main agent who interrogated me, Nikolai, he asked what I was doing in Transnistria. I said I'm a tourist because I didn't have press accreditation. And the first thing he does is he pulls out his cell phone and starts flipping through articles that I contributed to or wrote, and he says, "You're a liar." They strip searched me. They stripped me down to my underwear. I'm heavily tattooed, and they photographed all of them, printed them out. After about 7 or 8 hours, they came back and they told me that I had violated a 2016 law against criticizing the Russian troops stationed in Transnistria, and that my coverage was unfair to the Russian Federation and Pridnestrovia and Moldavian Republic, and I was getting deported. They were nice enough to take me back by my hostel and let me get my things, which I didn't expect that, so I'll give them a little bit of credit. They dropped me off at the quote-unquote border, and I had to walk past the Russian peacekeepers, and they were just awkwardly staring me down because I'm the only person on foot. I hitchhiked back to Chisinau and had a few days in Istanbul because I was tired and needed a vacation, and then after that, I was back in Ukraine. Now, about a week or two after I got deported, and I was held in the Ministry of State Security building. A few weeks after that, multiple gunmen attacked the Ministry of State Security building with RPGs. Dozens of RPGs blew holes into the side of the building, and from the video, I saw that my cell had the bars blown out. So I thought that was a bit funny. Now the question is, who did it? Because it happened on Orthodox Easter Monday when nobody was there, and nobody was killed. And then there was a series of other bombings, including at the Kobasna Ammunition Depot, which is Europe's largest depot, and if it blew up, it'd be 20 times larger than the Beirut explosion. It would kill people in Moldova and Ukraine proper. But it didn't go off, and nobody was killed there. The Grigori Pol transmitter was attacked, and nobody was killed there. There was an army unit that was attacked, and nobody was killed there. A lot of Ukrainians have said this has the handwriting of the FSB, and I tend to agree with them. Well, my question is, did Moscow order these bombings, or did the Transnistrians in their capital, Tiraspol, decide to do it to themselves? I mean, it makes no sense for the Ukrainians to want to open a second front. So even though Russia and Transnistria say Ukraine did it, I doubt that, especially considering the fact that nobody died. But regardless, that was my few days in a Russian-backed separatist state. And I actually brought a patch from Transnistria. It's right there. You'll want to take a look at it. And yeah, before I knew it, I was no, there's like on the table. And then, but regardless, they could pass that around if y'all wanted to. Regardless, I made my way back to Kharkiv, and then that's also the there's a Snake Island patch, Russian ship, go fuck yourself. That was a great one for morale. Even though the defenders at Snake Island, lost and were captured, it was like Dunkirk in a way. It was a noble failure, and it encouraged people to fight on. I made my way back to Ukraine and back to Kharkiv. So this was the battle that I decided I was going to spend most of my time on. And by this point, the counteroffensive had been quite successful, and they had managed to push the Russians back, and they started liberating villages outside of the city in Kharkiv Oblast. So these are more Saltivka. While I was on Saltivka, got bombed a lot more Smerch rockets stuck in the ground. And then this is going north. I went into no man's land in this place called Danlivka. It's north of Saltivka. I was there right after it was bombed. One of these houses coming up in a second is on fire from some grads. And then after that, returned back into Saltivka, and towards the safety, the relative safety of the city center. And then here's they never managed to bomb the train station, but they did bomb this random trolley, which I found interesting because when I returned to Kharkiv, I went from Moldova, after I got deported, I went from Chisinau in Moldova to Odessa, and then from Odessa, I went to Dnipro, and then I took a train from Dnipro to Kharkiv, and the train was filled with soldiers, and this is in April. And it was just insane how they never bombed it. They bombed the train station in Kramatorsk, but they didn't bomb the Kharkiv one. So they continued liberating villages and areas around Kharkiv Oblast, and the counteroffensive was very safe. Now, a lot of the civilians in Saltka, as I mentioned before, were sheltered in the metro. And I decided I was going to live with them and do that as well. So for about a week, I lived in the metro. I'd go into the city during the day to photograph the damage, and at night, I'd be in the relative safety of the train station. Some people brought tents and pallets. Some people just slept out in the open, like this man here. I slept in a train itself. It's very cold. It was difficult to sleep, miserable, but it was a safe place to be. So all the civilians were packed in there, and everybody there was just so helpful. They were all so helpful to me. I had to get it approved. This is the policeman. He asked I keep him anonymous, but he was about my age, spoke great English. He was a really good guy. Glad I got to know him over the course of that week that I was there. But so we worked out a compromise. It's as close as I could get to a portrait. This is Tanya. She was kind of my little guide. She spoke English. And Tanya's family was always super, super helpful. Even though I'm a foreign journalist with a home to go home to, and hers in Saltivka was destroyed, they were always happy to make sure, like, they'd offer me tea and coffee. I'd be working on my computer, and Tanya would bring me a coffee without me even asking. She's a super sweet girl. Yeah. A lot of my meals were made with that kettle there. A lot of instant ramen because the food situation is not always great. A lot of canned food, a lot of instant soup and instant ramen. Children would play. UNICEF donated toys and mats, and the kids were always a lot more agreeable to being photographed. They loved being on camera. The adults less so. But regardless, volunteers would come and bring stuff for the kids. The kids would decorate with art, and because all these children's drawings everywhere was a bit uplifting, a lot less depressing than a drab, empty subway. Here's a woman getting a haircut, some musicians. Everyone was trying to keep their spirits up. Eventually, I got to return to that spot where the deceased Russian was, and at this point, when I went there back in February, that's one of the further spots that the Russians had pushed into the city. And by this point, the Russians were far, far north of it, so this was completely abandoned. And we could just go to it with leisure at this point. We got to spend quite a bit of time here rather than just 20, 30 minutes because of shelling. But it was, see, there's the same armored personnel carrier as before, in its same spot. But it's still difficult because there's still a lot of ordnance around. So you still have to watch your step. But without the snow, it's easier. This is a SWAT policeman. This kid was 19, and he was helping do the bomb disposal. So just pulling ordnance up, which that's going to be a problem that Ukraine has to deal with for years to come. It's going to be like Vietnam, where farmers are years from now going to come across a cluster munition, and it's devastating. There's a grad in the street. There's another Russian VTR, a Russian hat that they'd left. And I went there with other territorial defense soldiers, but this time they were foreign. They were Americans, actually. The guy who was standing on top of that VTR on the last photo was actually a former U.S. Marine. When he got out, he decided to go volunteer for Ukraine. Now, another thing I did while I was living in the train station, could you go back to the police ones? was I got to go out with Kharkiv SWAT, and they would patrol the streets at night. And a lot of these photos are a little bit grainy because I was not allowed to use my flash because we have to be very careful with light discipline. Yeah, light discipline is something that got ingrained in me while I was there. Here he is checking the papers of somebody that we detained. So because there's a mandatory curfew, in Kharkiv it started at 8. Because there's a mandatory curfew, I called the police liaison. They arranged to have me picked up by the police, and I spent the night patrolling with them, so it was fun being able to break curfew. We detained a couple of people, no spies, unfortunately, just drunks. Detained a handful of drunks and took them back to the police station. If it's your first time, you just get a fine and then you get let go the next day. Here's a man being detained. This is in the village of Malaya Rohan, but those police actually did tell me that they managed to detain a Russian spy at the very beginning of the war. And I saw a Russian spy that was captured and detained early in Kharkiv. Unfortunately, they didn't let me take photos of him, which I was upset about. He had duct tape over his eyes and everything. So I had gone up to Kharkiv from Dnipro, and the soldier that drove me up dropped me off and gave me to Shrek. And then Shrek gave the spies to the other guy and sent them down to Dnipro. So here is in the village of, earlier is Vilkivka, now this is Malaya Rohan. This is an abandoned Russian position. So the counteroffensive was very successful, and they pushed north and northeast, pushing the Russians back, destroying armor in the process, and just liberating all of these villages in Kharkiv Oblast. And the Russians left behind a lot of debris. There was a mass grave here in Malaya Rohan. They pulled the bodies out right before I got there, but it still reeked. It was just rotted puddles of flesh. This is the Ukrainian or the Russian Jack-in-the-Box tank. So with the Abrams tank, we have the ammunition behind the turret. The Russians have this ingenious, sarcasm design where it's underneath the turret. So if it's hit in the right spot, the entire turret pops off, killing everybody inside. And that's why they're called Jack-in-the-Boxes. Here's a Russian helicopter. You can tell it's Russian because that infamous Z. This one was shot down by a Stinger. Yeah, as you can see, the turret is completely removed from the body of the tank. And nobody survived that. So as the counteroffensive was successful, villagers from the liberated areas were fleeing south into the relative safety, at least, of Ukraine. So they go deeper into Ukrainian territories. These are the next several of these slides are refugees from this village called Ruska Lazova. And Ruska Lazova was liberated in April, and all of these villagers are fleeing further south in the Kharkiv Oblast just in case the Russians launched another offensive and retook the village. But that has not happened. But all of the refugees had to be vetted, of course. So they had to vet them to make sure they weren't, Russian saboteurs before letting them be on their way. And then here's a Russian armored personnel carrier. The sandbags didn't do anything, and Azov killed this one. They tagged it, as you can see. Azov tagged it. And as they continued to push further north, this is north of Kharkiv, we came across an abandoned Russian position, and they had pressed this van into service and spray painted some Z's on it and called it a day. And so this is one of here's another van that they left abandoned. But they left lots of trash behind, but not much else. And there's in that general area. And then here's another one of Vilkivka is where this one was. This village was liberated, but not much was left of it. And then here's one of the few Ukrainian tanks I saw. This is a Ukrainian tank that was destroyed near Malaya Rohan, but it was in better condition than a lot of the tanks I saw. And shortly after that, I went to Donbass and did some civilian evacuations, but that's a whole other story for another time. But yeah, I saw Kharkiv get invaded, and Kharkiv they managed to hold, they held well, pushed the Russians back, and by the time I left, the city was completely liberated. Most of that oblast was liberated. And that was my time in Ukraine. Yeah, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
So I was curious this whole time, like how, in terms of the logistics of getting over there, were you pretty much on your own and kind of like on your own to decide where you wanted to go?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
I would sometimes be with other journalists, sometimes completely by myself. Being with other journalists was nice because you could split the cost of fixers and vehicles. In journalism, a fixer is like a tour guide. It's a local who speaks the language, who knows the area, to show you around. They're also kind of expensive, $100, $200 a day. But with other journalists, we were able to split the costs. But logistically, it was just pretty much wherever I thought was most important for me to go. So, I mean, I guess I could have stayed in Kiev and still seen everything, but I wanted to go as far east as I could. But yeah, any other questions?
And how were you traveling most of the time?
Mostly trains. So between major cities, I would take the train, which was a little bit concerning because sometimes they got bombed, not too often, but sometimes. I'd also take cars. I took a bus a few times. With cars, it would be with either civilian volunteers. So there were volunteers bringing supplies from Dnipro to Kharkiv, and I rode with them. And then other times I'd ride with soldiers. So when I went to Donbass, when I went to Severodonetsk and Kramatorsk, I rode in a van with territorial defense soldiers. Within the city itself, you could just ride around with this thing called Bolt. It's their version of Uber. So I have an anecdote. There was a very recent airstrike that happened, and the first thing I did was I called up a Bolt, and I'm in the car thinking to myself, damn, the Russians just, launched a Smerch rocket, and I hopped in. It's basically an Uber to go check it out. So I was amazed that was still working. So that's how I got around.
So earlier you showed some of the shelters, and they sheltered in the metro too, but did they have an existing sheltering system around for attacks like that?
So,
what was that about?
There's old Soviet stuff because they're worried about us dropping some nukes, but none of those were used too often. I mean, those were the nuclear shelters that did exist were in universities and some government buildings. Most people sheltered in their basements. Some people decided to shelter in place, which ended up being a poor decision. There was one family I interviewed whose son, Dimo, was killed when he was hit by shelling. So they were in the Saltovka neighborhood, and they decided to shelter in place, whereas Tommy's family is all still alive, and at the very beginning of the war, they decided to go shelter in the metro. But most of the people were living in basements.
When it came time for you to return to the U.S., I guess, were you out of time? Would you have stayed longer?
It was a mix of things. I have family here in the United States that I was looking forward to getting back to. I also have arthritis, unfortunately. I'm an arthritic 23-year-old, and I was without medicine for a while, so my shoulders were starting to hurt very badly. I would like to go back at some point, but I don't know if anytime soon. There are other stories that I plan on covering in the meantime.
Well, you kind of answered my second question, which was how did this do towards your flavor for journalism today?
This is most definitely the career for me. I mean, I started in 2020, and I've just been progressing in it a lot. And this year, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I've really cemented myself and made a lot of career progress.
Yeah.
You were there for 4 months, you said?
Yes, 4 months.
So 4 months, and you get back to the United States, what was the first thing you had to eat? What you want? I mean, you were just waiting.
What did you bring me, Isabel? Oh yeah, I got fried rice. That's what it is. Fried rice. I do miss sloppy food at this point though. But while I was there, there's a lot that I missed. It's like barbecue, fried chicken. There's so many southern foods. Mexican I missed.
Mhm.
Yeah, I got tired of borscht. Had a lot of borscht.
What, I guess from your, follow-on conversations after you've gotten back to the US and entered into discussions with Americans about the conflict, have you found yourself, educating them or frustrated with the perspective?
Oh, frustrated?
I mean,
The amount of people that ask, "Oh, did you serve? Were you in the military?" It's like, first off, look at my. Second, there are not U.S. troops in Ukraine. No, I did not serve. So it can be frustrating. There's a lot of ignorance. You have to do a lot of explaining at times, but and then if they hear like explaining that I got deported from a fake country, that
That's awesome.
people have some difficulty with that one. Yeah, that was fun.
So you win, 2 truths and a lie.
Yeah, right. Right.
Man, people are just not going to believe that one. But I was very. This is actually funny. When I was being interrogated, the Nikolai, he asked if I had a notebook, and I decided, okay, I'm going to play dumb. I know he's talking about a laptop, but I'm going to say no. I take all my notes on my phone. My laptop was hidden at my hostel under the mattress. Okay, so when they made the decision to deport me, and they were so kind as to take me back and let me get my things, my souvenirs mostly is what I was excited for, because when am I ever going to get to go back to Transnistria? They let me go inside by myself. The MGB said, you have 5 minutes, grab your things, get back to the car. Don't make us come inside and get you. I was like, holy shit, they're not checking me? So I thought they were just thinking, screw it, he's getting deported, it's not our problem anymore. So I went inside, I got my computer, they never found out I had my computer, and I didn't have to delete my photos of the Russian embassy.
So you have, it seems like you took security measures that are, I would say, fairly uncommon for a 23-year-old. So how did you know to do some of these things?
I would talk with other journalists who were more experienced. The thing that I would do was, even in Ukraine, there was difficulty with the police as far as what I could take pictures of and what I couldn't take pictures of. And sometimes it was just purely arbitrary. It's like there was this one instance where I took pictures of this one government building that was destroyed. And the reason I went there was because my friend told me to go check it out. And he was there earlier with Vice, helping on a documentary. So they let Vice film there. I come there about a week later, and we're taking pictures, and you start walking away, and I can see the soldiers running towards us. And I know he's going to make us delete stuff. So what I do is I just very quickly, I swap memory cards out, and I stuck it in my pants. Knew when I'm going to check there. Usually it doesn't happen. And my fixer was like, oh man, it's like 007. You just pulled it out and swapped it so fast. But so yeah, I guess I was a little bit more loose with security than a lot of people would be.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a compliment, very well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Did very wise thing. In the midst of very awkward and precarious circumstances.
Yeah, very, very precarious, for sure.
Oh, go ahead.
What was your daily attire? Do you have like body armor on, helmet,
Yes.
or?
So I have a helmet, a ballistic helmet that'll stop Kalashnikov, hopefully. Like I said, I forgot my respirator, unfortunately. I didn't think there was actually going to be any smoke. Little did I know. And then I brought my plate carrier with me. I had my level 4 plates. So I brought my plate carrier with me. I'm eventually going to update the plate carrier. I want to get a dangler so I don't get castrated by a rocket. I also want to get a neck gorget because I don't want to take a piece of shrapnel through the throat. But while I was there, it was just a regular plate carrier with a press patch. I had my IFAK right here, tourniquets here. So.
Did you get some strange questions from the airport security when you're flying with all that stuff?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. it's funny actually. When I was coming back from Poland, I was about to board my flight, and they called me, and they said, like, we found suspicious stuff in your luggage. You need to come with us right now. So the police detained me in Poland, and they pulled me into this back room, and they're like, okay, we're gonna open your bag. So I brought some shrapnel bits back home with me. So I brought a few pieces of grad rockets and some empty shell casings. And the Polish police were freaking out, thinking I've got bomb parts on me. And then when they open my bag and see it's all empty shrapnel, they just laugh. It's like, okay, you're good to go. So airport security wasn't a hassle. When I went to Turkey, they asked about my plates, but when I showed them my Ukrainian press pass and pictures from Ukraine, they're like, okay, you're fine. You're not PKK. You're just a journalist.
You're pretty lighthearted with this presentation.
I'm trying to be.
Heavy experience. How are you feeling?
It was dark. A lot of it was pretty dark, but you know, gotta keep your spirits up with that kind of thing.
So if I say I was gonna be your sponsor, if you plan your next trip, you didn't have to worry about the finance, where would you like to go? Just a general question.
Well, actually, next month I am going to Port-au-Prince in Haiti. So at the very beginning of November, I'm going to go to Haiti. As we all know, it's basically a failed state at this point. Their president was assassinated last year. The United Nations has sanctioned some of the gang leaders as if they're Al Qaeda. So I'll be in Port-au-Prince for a couple weeks next month. There are so many places I would love to go. I'd love to go to Yemen, Libya. I'd like to go back to Ukraine at some point. I mean, this war has been going on since 2014. It's not going to be ending anytime soon, I don't think. Well, thank you all very much for listening to what I had to say. I'm very glad I got to speak with you all.
Yeah, thank you.